really glad to be back with David Timms. Now, David, you have written this book, Shape Your World, right?
Correct.
And you are the Dean of Christian Leadership, the Christian Leadership School at William Jessup, correct?
Correct.
Okay, great. So I wanted to start actually with the first quote you put in the book. It was by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Because we're talking about leadership. You're all about leadership. This podcast is about leadership. And this is the quote that you start your entire book with. We need leaders not in love with money, but in love with justice, not in love with publicity, but in love with humanity. Leaders who can subject their particular egos to the pressing urgencies of the great cause of freedom. A time like this demands great leaders. Why did you choose that quote?
Oh, well, I just think that quote captures so much of what the book goes on to say, and that is that leadership is about producing change and building lives. It's not about, producing widgets and making profits. Those things happen, but they're secondary. And I just thought that was a great quote because the whole thing in that particular case with Martin Luther King Jr. is really talking about freedom. Just casts a bigger vision than many of us have for leadership. So I thought, let's begin there so that we kind of get past this. The leader is the boss figure. He's the person or she's the person who makes all the decisions. And no, there's a bigger vision for leadership to be had. So I thought, let's just begin with that quote. I felt good about that.
And I think it's a great quote, particularly today when we have such a large number of narcissists and so many messages coming at us that it's all about us and that type of thing. So I think it's a great place to start. And now I'm kind of curious, when we hear the word leader, what should we be thinking of? Who should we be thinking of? Specific people, types of people?
Yeah, and I've pondered that a lot, David, because we've all had a lot of authority figures in our lives, and I'm not sure that every authority figure is necessarily a leader. So when you ask that, it's a great question to ask. Who are the real leaders? And some people define leadership as just influence, and I think that's partly true. But when I'm thinking about leaders, and I define it, fairly simply as producing change and building lives, that's what leaders do. Transformational leaders. For me, that kind of narrows the field a lot. Now, when I'm thinking about leaders, I'm actually thinking of people who have done just that in my life. So the leader in my life is not the person that gives me my paycheck. That might be my boss, it might be my employer, but not necessarily my leader. The leader in my life are the people, sometimes a handful of them, who have helped produce change in my life and who have built my life specifically. They've invested in me in very tangible and sometimes intangible ways. So, for some of us, parents have been leaders by that definition. And for others, there have been spiritual leaders, maybe church leaders. Sometimes it's community people or mentors. So for me, when you say who should we be looking for leadership, as long as they fit that definition, I'm good to look in that direction.
Yeah, and hopefully we have some people at work
that
fit that also, that they are investing in us. And so, yeah, hopefully. But I agree with you. We have to look back when you think of how we behave in the workplace or outside of the workplace. A lot of it has to do with these people who've invested in our lives. You mentioned in the book early on, a lot of the dialogue where you get into is that we are currently facing a crisis in leadership. And, you state a number of statistics. I don't know whether you know any by heart, but you might have some favorites. I'm kind of curious to kind of jar our audience and kind of connect them with where you're saying crisis. Any of those stats come to mind?
Yeah, well, David, I actually cited a study that was nearly 10 years old now in the book because it was available to me. But I was a bit surprised 5 days ago to have the Barna organization come out with some stats, which was totally both fascinating and affirming, where they're saying that 82% of young adults, 18 to 25-year-olds, so these are not kids, but 82% of them say now that there is a crisis of leadership because there are not enough good leaders right now. 82%, which correlated with my study from 8-9 years ago, which suggested it was a little lower than that, maybe 78%. but that number's creeping up, and these are the emerging leaders, and in many cases current leaders saying we haven't got good leaders today, and that kind of catches our eye a little bit.
Well, that's a huge thing, and I saw that stat too. As a matter of fact, I think I put it in my newsletter last week. But you close out this introductory chapter. Once again, I'm gonna read it, and this will be the last thing I think I read out of the book. But you state, we face a crisis of leadership, not the lack of people who will lead, but the lack of people who can lead well. And I realize this is probably an hour-long conversation, but what do we do about that? Whether we're talking about your college, or we're talking about our business, or we're talking about a nation,
Yeah.
what do we do about that?
Well, my 30-second soundbite would be: we face a crisis because we haven't defined leadership. We don't know what leadership is. It's really not one of those things that you'll know it when you see it. So we haven't defined it. I would say define it and then develop it. And if we define what we're looking for in a leader, then we can actually take very specific steps to develop that kind of leader. Man or woman, doesn't matter. Whoever's in leadership, if we know what the definition is, we can do something about it. The crisis we've got is that we've got people in authority, and we've got people who are pursuing power, and they're not necessarily doing it with a leadership model in mind, except perhaps some self-interest. You mentioned narcissism, and we do see some of that as well. We see it in every area of our lives. So I would say define and develop, and we might actually be able to turn this big ship around in small degrees.
Yeah, and I guess basically you can define and develop it in any type of environment that you're in, whether that's in your family, whether that's in your neighborhood, your community group, whatever it might be, your business, your nonprofit, your government entity. So it really stretched out, but it has some flexibility, if I'm hearing you right.
Absolutely. And in my mind, as we talk about leadership, I'm thinking about families, parents leading their children. I'm thinking about nonprofit organizations. I'm thinking about the marketplace and businesses. I'm thinking about politics. What we are talking about really does cover the gamut.
That's great. So as we wrap up this intro on the crisis of leadership, which really kind of compelled you to write this book, what's the message that you'd like to have as a takeaway for our audience?
Well, I don't think I've got to convince anybody that we have a crisis. I think most of us feel that and know that. We sense it. We would probably be in the 82% if we're a part of that poll, right? So you and I don't need to convince anyone that we've got a crisis. The challenge is, how do we address that crisis? How do we move forward? And I think the takeaway for these few minutes of introductory material is, hey, let's define leadership so that we can then develop it in a meaningful, sustainable way.
Fabulous. Well, I think that's great. Well, thanks, David, for being with us. I look forward to our next episode where we dive into your specific model.
Great. Thanks, David.